It's been a while since I've covered anything Apple related on the channel, but I was personally excited for one of Apple's latest products, a MacBook. But not just another Air or Pro. This is the MacBook Neo, and it just so happens to be the cheapest MacBook that Apple has ever launched. The price isn't the only thing that intrigued me, as this MacBook is also powered by Apple's A18 Pro, which previously powered the iPhone 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max, but most importantly, Apple's A-series silicon has never powered a Mac device in the past. So as we always do here, I invite you to join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we dive into the MacBook Neo and find out what happens when the A18 Pro meets macOS. So as I mentioned, the MacBook Neo is definitely an intriguing product for me, since it's the cheapest MacBook that is also paired with Apple's A-series silicon. And so for the first time ever, we can really see how far we can push the A-series thanks to macOS, which will allow us to test PC gaming using crossover, as well as playing a host of native Mac games available on Steam, and finally pushing emulation capabilities with the A-series, which is definitely quite limited over in iOS, particularly because of the lack of JIT. Now, this is obviously not meant to be a review of the MacBook Neo, since by now I'm sure you've seen plenty of reviews pop up all over YouTube. Instead, I wanted to focus in on what I really enjoy doing the most here on the channel, which is pushing devices to their limits and finding out exactly what those limits might be. For those unaware, the MacBook Neo recently launched as Apple's budget MacBook option, which is available in two different models priced at $599 and $699 respectively. It is powered by the Apple A18 Pro chip, which features a 6-core CPU with 2 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores, as well as a 5-core GPU. Both models have 8GB of unified memory, a 13-inch liquid retina display with a resolution of 2408 by 1506 with a max brightness of 500 nits. We've got 2 USB-C ports, one of which supports USB 3.0 with video out, and the other supports USB 2.0. As well as a surprising inclusion of a 3.5mm headset port, and then speakers on each side of the MacBook. On board, there's Wi-Fi 6E as well as Bluetooth 6.0. Finally, the two models have either 256GB or 512GB of internal storage, and so the extra $100 does get you double the storage as well as Touch ID, which is only available on the more expensive option. By the way, both models are available with an EDU discount for $100 off, which means that you can potentially get the Neo for $499 or $599 in the US, and I do think that the college demographic will be a huge target for this particular MacBook. So now that we're all familiar with the MacBook Neo, let's just dive into this and start talking about games. I'll split this up into different categories, but first things first, let's check out some games that are available natively for macOS, and specifically make use of the ARM chipset as well as the Metal backend from Apple. Now I see this all the time, and while many don't consider MacBooks to be gaming devices, you might be surprised to find out that MacBooks can actually do a considerable amount of gaming, and just on the App Store alone we can find a wide range of games that will work great here on the MacBook Neo. But I was curious about some more demanding experiences, and so of course the big one that probably has better than expected performance here is Cyberpunk 2077, and honestly I wasn't expecting a lot, but this game does fare better than one might think. I will say that every game here being featured in this showcase, and for each section where I'm using screen recording, performance is going to be better and smoother without the screen recording. So just keep that in mind when watching the direct capture footage. So for Cyberpunk 2077, I started out with the for this Mac setting and then kind of adjusted from there. I typically like to undersell performance, and so my goal here is just to get things as stable as possible when it comes to the frame rate. For this footage here, I did adjust things across the board to the lowest settings possible and then went with a performance preset using Metal FX upscaling with a target of 30 frames per second. And yeah, this is definitely running better than I expected. There are definitely stutters when driving around, but it does smooth out as the game compiles assets. Now, I've been on a bit of a Resident Evil kick lately, and I actually just finished Resident Evil Requiem last week, and so I decided to check out the awesome remake of Resident Evil 4, which is also available natively on Mac and directly on the Apple App Store. This is another game that probably has no business running as well as it does here on the A18 Pro. For this game, I am set to a resolution of 1920 by 1080, but using the performance preset, with Metal FX upscaling, and it does work quite well at a target of 30 frames per second using the lowest settings across the board. And I will say that I did test a 60 frames per second cap, and it can actually get up to 60 frames per second at times, but I chose to lock it to 30 for the best frame rate stability, especially during more chaotic scenes. This is another game that definitely impressed me with its performance. Now, I don't know how aware my audience is of this, but the Steam app is actually available natively for Mac, and you can download the Steam app and access it right on the MacBook and even sort your library for Mac-compatible games. Now, while you won't have access to your entire library doing this, there are some notable games that will install and run just straight from the Steam, and at least for me, games that occupied a good amount of my personal playtime recently and in the last year. In fact, we can go as recent as Slay the Spire 2, which dropped just a few days ago and is in early access on Steam, and from day one has a Mac-compatible version that works incredibly well here on the MacBook Neo. And sure, this isn't a AAA game, but this is a very notable indie game and sequel to one of my personal favorites that I have talked about plenty in the past on the channel. And speaking of notable indie games, I tried out both Hades 2 and Hollow Knight Silksong, and both of these games just ran great, again just installing and playing straight from Steam. For Hades 2, I am set to the native resolution of the MacBook Neo, which is 2408 by 1506, using high settings with a target of 60 frames per second, and the performance for Hades 2 is really good, regardless of how chaotic the scene was. I didn't encounter any stutters or frame dips, and this is an example of the perfect game to play on something like the MacBook Neo, and really, Hades 2 is such a high-quality game. The same goes for Hollow Knight Silksong, which I actually started out on the Switch 2, put about 10 hours into it, and then realized I'd rather play it on PC, and then finally gave up about 5 hours in over there because I am absolutely terrible at the game, which is a bummer since I actually really do enjoy Hollow Knight, as well as the awesome art style and graphics. Now, for Hollow Knight Silksong, I am again set to the native resolution of the MacBook Neo, and while there aren't many things to adjust here for the graphics, I do have the particle effects set to high. The game runs pretty well. It does have an odd stutter here and there at this resolution, and with a 60 frames per second target, but it doesn't really seem to impact gameplay. Now, I wanted to check out the native version of Control, which is a fantastic game from one of my favorite studios, Remedy, and I do wish we had more of these high-profile games ported natively to utilize Metal, as this performs a lot better than I was expecting using the A18 Pro. I've got the game set here to a resolution of 1920 by 1080 with Metal FX upscaling set to 960 by 544 using the lowest settings across the board, but with a target of 60 frames per second. And for the most part, the game does hold that frame rate with dips during more chaotic scenes, and you can always cap to 30 frames per second if you prefer, but I like leaving it at 60, and this is quite playable with the MacBook Neo, and again another impressive demonstration of a game that specifically uses the Metal backend. Finally, I had to check out a very recent release, as in just the other day, with Crimson Desert, since I was surprised to find that there is a native Mac version available, and so if you know me well, you know I don't shy away from trying something crazy. And yes, this experiment was a bit crazy, as while I'm shocked the game runs even at all, it's definitely a bit too much for the MacBook Neo, and so this is definitely not a game you will be playing here, and probably shows the limitations despite having a native Mac version. So with some examples of native gaming out of the way, which definitely is the most ideal way to enjoy games on a Mac, let's now check out PC gaming using Crossover, which does allow a Mac user to potentially play their PC games from Steam and other sources on their Mac through a translation layer. Now, there are additional software that can do something similar, but for this I will be using the latest version of Crossover. As one might expect, this will always have some limitations, but for the most part it does work pretty well, especially with the higher end Macs using the latest M series Apple Silicon. But this video is about the MacBook Neo, and so I was genuinely curious about how things might fare here with Crossover using the A18 Pro, and this is something that could never be explored in the past since the A18 Pro was only available with the iPhone, which doesn't have Crossover available on the iOS platform. And I had a lot of fun exploring what the possibilities are here with the MacBook Neo, since this opens it up to a huge world of games that are available on PC. And so between the native options and now the ones running through Crossover, we are effectively expanding the library of games that can be played. I will say that it's probably best to temper your expectations, since I tested a range of games, and generally what I found was that either older or indie style games fared a whole lot better than some of the more demanding games. I even went as far as testing a very recent release with Monster Hunter Stories 3, which amazingly launched, but it's obvious we are hitting the realistic capabilities of the MacBook Neo, at least with something like Crossover, and I do think the combination of the limited 8GB of RAM and the chipset itself is just a bit too much to go really beyond the older or indie style games I mentioned earlier. And while something like God of War technically runs, I'd say that this isn't the most ideal experience or even close to the best way to experience this game. And that's okay, because honestly there are plenty of games that will run well, and something like Absolum, which is a fairly new release, and an awesome indie style roguelike beat 'em up that I highly recommend everyone check out, runs quite well using low settings with a target of 60 frames per second. The same goes for Lumines Arise, a personal favorite of mine and also a fairly new release in the Lumines franchise that has beautiful visuals and an amazing soundtrack, and this is one that ran better than I expected, again using low settings with a target of 60 frames per second. And in terms of older games, I really wanted to check out the Halo Master Chief Collection here, and I specifically tested Halo 4, and this is a great example of an older game that looks absolutely stunning here and can run using the enhanced graphics setting, and it's remarkable just how well it works with crossover and the MacBook Neo. The entirety of this collection is a great performer and really showcases that just because it's an older game doesn't necessarily make it less worthy to consider for your playtime. And I think many will be very pleased to see something like Halo running here on the MacBook Neo. I could easily dedicate an entire video to just testing PC games here with the MacBook Neo, because really there are so many possibilities of one might be able to play and test. Okay, so let's now head on over to the world of emulation, and I'll do things a bit differently here and start out with the most performant and then end the emulation showcase with what I'd consider not as playable with the MacBook Neo. The great news is that emulation for the most part is really good with the MacBook Neo, and definitely a highlight. Nowadays we have many options and native ARM builds for Apple Silicon that equally work well here with the A18 Pro, and it's cool to see what we can actually do with the A18 Pro, since in the past we were limited by iOS. Basically everything from the 5th generation and earlier shouldn't be an issue with the MacBook Neo, so let's first start out with some PlayStation Portable using the PPSSPP emulator, which does have a native ARM build. And I've had it on screen here, and it goes without saying that the A18 Pro is barely breaking a sweat, with many games very easily able to hit the max upscaling of 10 times the native PSP resolution, and that includes games like Ridge Racer and Wipeout Pure, so it's not just limited to something lighter like Loco Roco. And of course, everyone's favorite benchmark game, God of War Chains of Olympus, does very well here running at 6 times the native PSP resolution, so I think overall, if you're wanting to check out PSP emulation, you will do very well here with games really able to push that upscale. The same goes for the Nintendo Gamecube using the Dolphin emulator, another one that has a native ARM build, and for Gamecube specifically, we can get up to an upscaling of at least 6 times the native resolution, which is the equivalent of 4K, and for a game like F-Zero GX, it does very well at this setting, which means that, for the most part, a good portion of the Gamecube library will be able to enjoy this level of upscaling if so desired. And of course, while we have Dolphin loaded up, let's quickly check to see how things fare here with the Wii. And given how well Gamecube runs, I expected much of the same for the Wii, and for the more demanding titles, you will need to drop the resolution scaling down a bit. For example, I've got Sonic Colors here running at 4 times the native Wii resolution. And I will say for both Gamecube and Wii, it's important to disable the skip duplicating frames option under enhancements in the graphics option, as this will allow the games to run with the very smooth frame pacing that you can see here in the metal stats. So while we are still talking about Nintendo consoles, let's quickly check out how 3DS emulation fares, and for this I am using the latest build of Azahar, which does have support for macOS, and again, it's another platform that does exceptionally well here, as long as the emulator supports the game properly, but I was able to really crank up the upscaling for games like Super Mario 3D Land and Mario Kart 7. Both of which are running at 7 times the native 3DS resolution, and really only with some minor stutters because of shader compilation that does smooth out very quickly and with more gameplay time. It's definitely nice having a larger screen with 3DS, since most of the games here didn't really rely on the bottom touchscreen, and so we can easily opt to do a smaller bottom screen or just go with the large single screen, which looks super awesome all cleaned up at 7 times upscaling. So let's jump back on over to the Sony side and check out some PlayStation 2 emulation, and this is another very pleasant surprise. I tested all my usual favorites like Burnout Revenge and Outrun 2006, with Burnout Revenge running at 4 times the native PS2 resolution, and Outrun 2006 running at 3 times the native PS2 resolution, since this is typically a trickier title to run with PS2 emulation. These are some of my personal favorite racing games, and it is a real treat to see them running this well on a laptop that is passively cooled with this level of upscaling. Of course, I'd never forget about Kratos, and I did test God of War 2, which ran at 4 times the native PS2 resolution. I will say again, the A18 Pro impresses, and it really does show what can be achieved with software that is natively built for ARM and Apple Silicon. And considering I typically deal with devices that have some type of active cooling when covering PS2 emulation, this is running God of War 2 at 4 times the native resolution with just passive cooling, and doesn't thermal throttle at these settings either, which we can see later on for my quick battery test that I did for fun. So it's now time to jump back to the Nintendo side and check out some Nintendo Switch emulation. And I did say I was going to go in order of what I thought performed best with the MacBook Neo. But what I wasn't really expecting was just how good Switch emulation was going to be. And honestly, out of all the platforms here, I am probably most impressed by the way Switch performs with the A18 Pro. Mostly because I wasn't expecting much, and it is pretty wild to see. At first, I did use the latest version of the Eden emulator, but I found that tracking down an old build of Ryujinx fared a lot better with the MacBook Neo, and there is actually a native ARM build of Ryujinx for Mac. In fact, I've done a whole video dedicated to this topic back in the day with the M3 chip, if you're curious. So with Ryujinx, I did manage to run a good number of the Switch library, and again had more success with games just working properly here with Ryujinx, and so while it is no longer being developed for, it did seem to still work better for me with the MacBook Neo specifically. You've probably seen on screen a selection of some of my personal favorites and some go-tos that I like to use for Switch testing, and in terms of performance, we are at the native Switch resolution, and I was switching either between handheld or dock mode depending on the game and performance. There will be some dips here and there because of the shader compilation that takes place, especially when playing a game for the first time, but in my experience it smooths out quite a bit for most games, and even going with something like Super Mario Odyssey, which performed quite well, especially after the shader compilation completed. Now I couldn't resist, and I did test out some Tears of the Kingdom, which again ran better than I expected, but this is probably the limit for the MacBook Neo. But with some patience and perhaps a bit more playtime, since this game has a tremendous amount of shader compilation, the game is very close to a playable state. But regardless, I do think that given what we've seen here, a good portion of the Switch library will run quite well as long as the emulator itself supports the game in terms of compatibility. And so a game like Tears of the Kingdom is obviously the ceiling in terms of performance with the MacBook Neo. So while we are on the topic of Nintendo, let's check out Wii U, and I do think that overall you will surprisingly have better success with Switch emulation over Wii U. And as of right now, CEMU does have an ARM build, but it's pretty old and more of an early build which has issues with stability and compatibility depending on the game. So I tested with both the latest available CEMU for macOS as well as the experimental ARM build, but for this footage here I am using the Mac version available straight from the CEMU website, which does depend on Rosetta for the translation layer. And it still manages to perform pretty well overall despite not being an ARM build. For those that know me well, shouldn't be surprised by some of my usual favorites on screen here, including Fast Racing Neo, which does perform well at the Wii U's native resolution, which for this game is 1280 by 720. Another game I love testing with Wii U emulation is Yoshi's Woolly World, which does not have a Switch version, but it was surprisingly ported to the 3DS, and so I do like the Wii U version since it is the best looking one out of the two, and it's just a cute and charming game. This is a game that does depend heavily on shader compilation during the first playthrough, but it does smooth out tremendously the more you play, and I'd say that this one is one that will run quite well with CEMU. And finally, another pretty popular game that received a remaster for the Wii U, The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker HD, is another game that surprisingly was never brought over to the Switch, and so this is unique to the Wii U, and another great game to check out with Wii U emulation using CEMU. Now heading back into the Sony camp, another platform that honestly shocked me in terms of performance was the PlayStation 3 using RPCS 3. And RPCS 3 does have a native ARM build, and so I was quite optimistic that we would see some solid performance. And one thing to keep in mind with PlayStation 3 emulation in general is that there's a lot of shader compilation that takes place, especially on the initial playthroughs. And depending on the game, some have it worse than others. But with time it does smooth out quite a bit. And again, for those that know me and regulars to the channel, I absolutely adore RPCS 3, and really it is one of the finest emulators out there, and I have covered it across various platforms and devices, and so it's nice to give a bit of attention here with the Mac and the MacBook Neo. As always, I started out with my usual lighter tests like Resogun, which ran quite well, and then started to scale up in terms of more demanding games, and so I checked out some Ratchet & Clank Tools of Destruction, which likewise ran very well, and surprisingly even a game like MotorStorm Apocalypse ran well, though I did have some compatibility issues with MotorStorm, since it would frequently just get stuck on a loading screen before a race, but when it does load, it ran and I'm honestly shocked. Finally, I had to test everyone's favorite benchmarking game for RPCS 3, and with God of War 3, I do think it's really the max of capabilities for the MacBook Neo. but it does run, and sometimes can even hit a playable 30 frames per second. Now, it's definitely not what I would consider ideal, but it's still neat to see nonetheless, and as always for underpowered devices like the MacBook Neo, you will want to utilize all the performance patches and tricks to get it running as you see here. Now last, but certainly not the least, is Xbox 360 emulation, and in the past, there was really only one way to do this on Mac, which is using a specific Xenia Canary experimental build, which removes the AVX check through crossover, and so as you probably can imagine, this isn't the most ideal way to go about playing Xbox 360, but really it was the only feasible way. Surprisingly, it does work when you start to look at the more powerful M-series chips like the latest M5 lineup, and sadly, there's just not enough juice here with the MacBook Neo to brute force performance. But not all is lost, and it just so happens that as I was wrapping this video up, XeniOS for Mac and iOS launched, and so the good news at least is that I was able to sneak it in and test last minute. Unfortunately, since it is very early in development for Mac, it's not very compatible, and most of the games I tested crashed before even getting into a game. And so unsurprisingly, given the situation here, Xbox 360 emulation is just not a reality right now with the MacBook Neo, but that could very well change in the future. And finally, just for fun, I did a battery test with God of War 2 using PCSX2 at a 4x resolution upscaling with 50% brightness and 50% volume with both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned on, and it surprisingly managed about 5.5 hours of on-screen time before the battery saver kicked in at the last moment, which completely tanked performance. But I think that's pretty solid and allows you to get some decent emulation gaming in for maybe a flight from the West Coast to the East Coast without a charge. And with that, we've reached the end of this video, and I think the MacBook Neo is a very interesting piece of hardware. And personally, I think this is going to be a very popular laptop since it brings the right balance of features, performance, and build quality at a price that makes sense. I think in particular, students are going to really take to this MacBook, and while it's certainly not targeting gaming, it's obvious that the Neo can still do plenty when it comes to gaming, especially on the emulation side. And so for someone who maybe bought one of these or plans on buying one of these to handle their basic productivity tasks, will be happy to know that they can take a break from their work to dive into the wide world of possibilities with the Neo. I hope you enjoyed this brief look at gaming with the MacBook Neo, and as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.